Everyone. Welcome to the last seminar of the semester. I think our speaker today, Nandini, is speaking to us on India time. So I'm extremely grateful to her for talking to us at this hour. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Nandini Velho. She is currently faculty at Shrishti Institute of Law Design, Shrishti Manipal Institute of Law Design and Technology. She has a postdoctoral, she has a postdoc from the Earth Institute at Columbia University and a PhD from James Cook University. I think Nandini, growing up, I think Nandini's science was always accessible to a lot of people because she publishes a lot in popular media. Her work in Northeast India and her integration of social sciences with more traditional ecological research, I think really makes her special. She also has written a bunch of management plans working with state park officials. And so I think with that introduction, I'm very excited to open up the floor to Nandini.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for that, Shivona. Shivona and I go a long way back to our master's course where we did our master's together, but I was her senior quite a few batches apart. But Shivona and I have written, speaking of popular articles, Shivona and I have written a popular article together. And I very fondly remember that association. So I was very glad to be able to work on US time, which I was doing not very long ago when I was doing my postdoc. So today I'm trying to get this as a full slide show, but if I can't, please bear with me. So today I'm actually here to talk about the work I've been doing in a place that has been very special to me. It's called the Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary. It's on the border of India and China and Tibet as well. So if you look, and Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary is part of a protected area in the northeast in the northeast of India. And if you look at legal protection that has been afforded to varying forest types, you find that tropical and subtropical forests, where the sort of forests that you find in some parts of the Amazon and some parts of India as well, they cover about 20% of the land area. And within that 20%, if you look at strictly protected areas, which is protected areas which fall under the category of IUCN 1 to 4, they cover just 5.8% of the land. So what happens then is that it's important to look at not only areas that are within these strictly protected areas, but also areas outside. And this is particularly important in the areas that many of us work in. And so also this is not different to the northeast of India. So for instance, these are a range of degradations that I happen to see while I was doing field work in Arunachal Pradesh, where on one hand you can see that there is active logging that is happening within the protected area. There are lots of invasive species. There are linear intrusions that are coming up, and yet there are also forests that are relatively undisturbed, like the two pictures on the right, on the bottom left. And if you look at community managed lands, the sort of land use patterns seems to be more stark in the areas that I work in. So You have a mix of shifting cultivation, you have some active deforestation and some active logging that is happening. You have forests that are under recovery, and you also are able to see some relatively undisturbed forests in community managed lands as well. So, in my presentation today, what I am going to try and address is a question that has interested me as a biologist, and that's the question of space. So, what are the species that are found in this really important place for biodiversity conservation? And the question about time that I was really interested in, and this was more or less like a function of just being in field and talking to people and soaking in to some of the stories that the landscape had to offer. The second question that came about from that was to look at how these areas where these special species were found have changed over time. And so, coming to the very broad questions of space, uh, where I used a range of ecological methods that have been traditionally used. My questions were: what are the merits of government-controlled lands versus community-managed lands for biodiversity conservation? Specifically, what I wanted to figure out was how does the occurrence of a wide range of hunted species change across these two regimes of protected area versus community managed, and what are the perceptions of residents of wildlife in these two regimes. And if you look at protected areas and community managed lands, we've known for a long time that parks, protected areas are effective in stopping really hard threats like land clearing, rampant logging, uh, fire to a great extent, and a bit of grazing. If you look at community managed lands, you find that there was a somewhat recent study that found that deforestation was actually lower in multiple use areas. And when you look at the context of India, there is forest loss that is happening within the PAs, within all protected areas. There have been records of deforestation in more than 50% of India's parks. And the areas around these protected areas are facing even greater loss of forests, about 66%. But a limitation of many of these past studies is that often these comparisons are unmatched. So you're often comparing a protected area or a series of protected areas from one particular landscape, and then you are looking at community managed lands in another landscape and another setting. And that often makes those comparisons unmatched. And there's also then very little information on biodiversity values. A lot of the information relates to, like what the previous slide showed you, a lot of the information relates to um, deforestation, finding metrics of fire or frequencies. And so a lot of nuance related to biodiversity gets lost out. There have been few studies where they have started to do these matched comparisons in protected areas and the community managed lands around. And those studies have actually found that fire frequencies were perhaps higher in the protected area, possibly because in the community managed lands, there are people who are living there and might be able to put it off faster. So coming to where I work, Arunachal Pradesh, it's in the northeast of India, flanking China and Tibet, and it spans two biodiversity hotspots. Um, it has 60% of its forests that are managed by communities, and this paradigm is somewhat different from other parts that exist in mainland India. So Arunachal Pradesh is in a geosensitive space where, because there has been a war in 1962 with China. There are about 26 different tribes that live in the different river valleys. A lot of them are dependent on firewood and the forest for food and to subsidize their income. And in parallel, Arunachal Pradesh is also an extremely interesting and exciting place to be in as a wildlife biologist. So, for instance, when I first went to Arunachal Pradesh, way before my just way before my undergrad, I went as a volunteer to figure out this bird. And this bird in the middle here, it was called the Bugun leochicla. It was not yet described. It was in the process of being described to science. And it was the first bird to be described after India's independence. And it was found in Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary. So to answer my first question about protected areas and community managed lands, um, where were these hunted species found? Were it in protected areas or community managed lands? I used a combination of transects and camera trappings. And basically, because it's not also a very easy place to work in, um, I had to use the road as my sampling backbone. So I use the road as my sampling backbone, and where in every 1 kilometer segment of the road, I would go off and go and I had U-shaped transects where I enumerated signs of species, did vegetation plots, and contrasted these transects that I had chosen based on stratification. So in the protected area, for the camera trapping, I did the same. I had to use, there's no other option, but I had to use the road as my sampling backbone to reach some of these very inaccessible areas. And the reason that I didn't get a lot of, I couldn't sample enough in the community managed land, and it was lesser than that of the protected area, was because of elephants, thefts, and a lot of the challenges that come about with having to do field work. And so that's an example of, when I say a road, that's really an example of what a road in my field site looks like. And these have been some of the most wonderful people I have met in life, who have also made fieldwork happen for me to a large extent. And I'm really grateful to that. So this is a typical example of how we'd have to make fieldwork happen in Arunachal. And we used to have a largest team, we still do, of very diverse people, young and old, who've taken us to the forest and seen us through very tough times. To the point where this used to be my assistant to the left for my PhD, and after every transect that we would do, he would come back with a great amount of certainty that this would be the last transect he would ever do in his life. And he used to tell me, why don't you call your PhD supervisor from Australia to understand these conditions and that what he's putting you through. But finally we were able to reach middle ground, and a lot of that middle ground was also somewhat bought, where we used to have a drink in the evening and talk about it and then decide, okay, tomorrow is going to be another day. But we lived through that, and we were able to collect data despite all the challenges. And the predictions of the study were pretty straightforward. So if you look at protected areas, which is in the blue, and community forest in the orange, on your x-axis you have a level of increasing disturbance, and on the y-axis you have a model proportion of segments occupied, the data I would get from my transects. And so I expected that protected areas would would have a higher number of segments occupied, and less than community forests. And for both, we would see a decreasing level of species occurrences as disturbance increased. And so to sort of disaggregate what that disturbance metric was, uh, I classified this axis into two parts. So the data here again was derived from my transects, and it was derived from um, vegetation plots that I did on each transect. And I started to overlay the different variables that I had collected from my transect information to figure out, did it really make did this disturbance metric make ecological sense for the community managed land, which had a varied degree of land use types. So this is canopy cover. This is the relationship of canopy cover with protected area and community forest being in the orange and red. So you see that as disturbance increases, canopy cover goes down. So what I basically did is, this is now being translated into schematic, where on the x-axis I have canopy cover. I also found that tree height and tree density was higher in undisturbed areas. What did more disturbed areas mean? They had higher prints of humans in different forms and doing different things. They had a higher number of invasive species like Mycenia and Lantana in some cases. And there was much more activity of wood chopping that was happening, and cut stumps in these degraded areas. And so that gave me some level of certainty that my disturbance metric for the community managed land was making some sort of biological sense. And so then I decided to model the proportion of segments that were occupied as a function of disturbance. So if you look here, I just want to illustrate a very few examples of some species that I'd like to show you results of. So if you look at the three species, the elephant, the gore is a bovid. It's about 1,000 kgs, and the sero is a slightly larger, it's a slightly smaller animal that you find on steep hill slopes. And so if you look at how did these three species respond to these two protection regimes, it seemed that in protected areas for elephants, gore, and maybe and sero as well, the intercepts were definitely higher. So these species were found more in our study in the protected area uniformly. And there were some species that quite strangely, like for instance, the gore, seemed to be doing very well in the protected area with an increased level of disturbance. So in my next slide, I will be showing you what that increased level of disturbance would be. But in the logistic GLM that I used, there was another important predictor of the proportion of segments occupied, and that was the distance to road. So now if you had to map the distance to road on the two types of on the types of disturbances that were seen in the protected area and the community managed lands. So in the community managed lands, through the initial graphics, I was able to show you what that metric of disturbance looked like in the protected area. You might have to look at it right here, where disturbed forests were forests that were recently had a history of fire, and there were some forests that have been recently selectively logged, and bamboo was taking over large parts of those recently logged forests. In the disturbed forests of the community managed land. So on the bottom, I didn't explain this before, but on the bottom, orange is community managed, and on the top, blue is protected areas. So on the bottom is community managed lands, and disturbed forests look like what I showed you. And the undisturbed forests in both protected areas and community managed lands that I sampled looked almost the same. And so then if I had to place from my logistic GLM where exactly these species were found, you see that in protected protected areas and community managed lands, the elephant was found in in both habitats, in relatively undisturbed habitats close to the road, right? And the gore showed an exactly opposite pattern, where the gore was found far away from the road in more bamboo sort of patches in the protected area. There were other species like sambar that showed a similar trend to the gore. That's the Himalayan black bear. And the Himalayan black bear was found in undisturbed areas of the protected area and the community managed lands um, at roughly the same frequency. Then there were species like Sero that were found more in the, that were again found in the protected area and community managed lands. And disturbance rather than type of protection seemed to be a more important predictor. And there were other species that were, this was somewhat surprising, where wild pig were found in undisturbed areas of the protected area and the community managed land, somewhat far away from the road. It's very likely that we didn't see a lot of wild pig in the community managed disturbed forests because they might have been hunted. And that was barking deer, which shows the same, somewhat same pattern. And we also found a lot of signs of small carnivores, but what we could only do with small carnivores was treat them as a guild and see what were the signs that we found. And these small carnivores were really, really exciting. Carnivores, like from having a marble cat to a leopard cat or golden cat. So treating them as a guild somehow felt a bit unfair and unjustified. So that was one of the reasons where I really, really wanted to do camera trapping in these landscapes to figure out what these small carnivores are. So that's exactly what we did. Where we had 42 1 by 1 square kilometer grids, where we placed cameras for 40 days, and every 20 days we rotated it around that grid. So this is an example of a golden cat that we got in a community managed land that is regularly burned. That's an example of a marble cat from a more undisturbed protected area. This is an example of the red panda. This red panda was found in the community managed lands in a bamboo patch. And this is an example of the yellow-throated martin. A yellow-throated martin is a fairly common species that is found both in the community managed lands and the protected area, and often close to roads. So how did we analyze this data? So if you, before I get to that, if you look here, you see these bubbles, and the size of the bubble is directly proportionate to the size of the animal. And the reason that I've depicted it like this is that I was really interested in finding out and understanding whether there was a body size gradient that one could observe in a protected area that was somewhat different from that of a community managed land. So if you look at this graph, what you will see here is two parts. So the part with the blue triangle indicates that species that are found here, or the bubbles from the last plot, indicate that we had higher capture rates in the protected area. And species that were found here, we had higher capture rates in the community managed lands. So what we found was that there were lots of large species in the protected area, right? And in the community managed lands, there were a lot of smaller species. But we were also very interested because the Eastern Himalayas are a super, super interesting place to be in. We were also interested in figuring out what is the threat status of these species. So if you overlay threat status of these species, what you see is that you find threatened species of larger bodied species and smaller bodied species in both regimes. So that's somewhat indicative of different, like basically these two different protected regimes having different importance for the conservation that we wanted to do later. Um, in parallel, apart from only looking at where these species were found, I was also very interested in understanding why there weren't particular species in particular landscapes, and what were people's perceptions of species decline. So interviewees did report that they had seen decline of larger bodied species in their community managed lands. So the larger bodied species are depicted as orange here, and the protected area is depicted as blue. So that takes us to a couple of take-home messages here, where protected areas have large and hunted species that are still found there. Community managed lands have smaller species. Threatened species are found in both regimes. And through the interviews that I showed you, community managed lands have reported greater declines of larger bodied species. But yet there have been some species that have benefited from cultural moves that I will tell you about a bit later. And so over the course of collecting my data during my PhD, one thing I really enjoyed, and if there is any advice that I could ever give an international student, is that sometimes you feel that there are trade-offs of being far away from the place that you want to do field work in. And yes, there are, but at the same time, if there is a way with your guide that you can figure out how to spend time in field and really spend quality time in field, which at that point might feel that it might feel a bit tangential, or do I really need to do it? I honestly believe that some of the best work that can come out from our PhDs and a lot of the work that defines us later actually comes from spending time in field. So if you do have that option as an international student, it'd be great to try and figure that out. And so in a similar way, I could have very well gone back to Australia to collect data. Um, but I wanted to really stay on with the community and just have them see some of the results that I had had. And while entering all the data and collecting all the data, I did more or less all of that from field, and just taking those maps back and showing them where those species were found, showing them the picture of that red panda in the bamboo next to the places that they live in. They started to ask us, can you help us map? And I started to then tell them, but hey, these are the spots that I think are also important. And so then we started to overlay, okay, let's look at watersheds of where the village gets its water from. And we started building up upon layers of information. And we started also walking and surveying the areas where there was biodiversity on one hand, and on the other, there were also other cultural and ecosystem services that were of importance to the community. So once we started doing that, long story short, but these are like they almost feel like a couple of slides, a couple of years in a few slides. Long story short, the place where the Bugunleo Chikla, the first bird that was described to India's independence, finally got a home. It was called the Singchung Bugun Village Community Reserve, and it's named after the bird is named after the Bugun tribe, and the community reserve is named after the Bugun tribe. And this is the village leader who's inaugurating the community reserve with the divisional forest officer by the side. And that little red panda that I got a photo of in the community managed lands in the bamboo patch was something that the community was very thrilled about. And they were thrilled about it to the point where they sort of decided that they wanted to make the Bugunleo Chikla a smaller, less conspicuous component of the logo that we ultimately came up with together. And that is the Bugunleo Chikla and the red panda, a mascot of the Singchung Bugun Village Community Reserve. And on the left is my colleague, who is part of the 10 people who patrol the forest from the Bugun community, who's really liked this logo and started to wear it in volleyball matches and football matches wherever he goes. So coming back to my reflections of have maintaining quite a lot of journals while I was in field. Um, and soon when my PhD started to wrap up, um, I really wanted to get into this aspect of what do these same landscapes look like in time, but not through the eyes of just an ecological study, or like, through the eyes of remote sensing. So what I started to notice during the course of my PhD and just speaking to people was that there were a lot of unique events. And by unique events, I mean that this was the same protected area where the Dalai Lama in 1959, he escaped from Tibet. And there's one little white horse here, and that's him as a young boy on a white horse as he was escaping to Tibet. And while the world wondered where he was actually trekking through Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary. And given that it was so remote, nobody really knew where he was, except a lot of people from the community itself. And Dalai Lama has then had a very significant, has been visiting the area quite often in 2003 and 2009. He's come back to the area. So I knew a lot of the unique events that were happening in my site. And slowly, what I wanted to build a conceptual model around was um, the aspect of uh, time has events. There is a certain knowing to events by just asking people the who about the who, what, why, when. And it's also about taking it a step further where you specifically ask about personal experiences and you document those personal and embedded experiences. And what I really wanted to then build on was, can you find a way to reminiscence where you can create these logical relations of stories to each other and weave the story back of your protected area. So simply in this context, my idea was, how do people remember the forests that they protect? So how did they remember the Singchung Bugun Village Community Reserve, and how did they remember Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary? Um, for that, what we did is that we specifically were interested in recreating the missing links of the history of the wildlife sanctuary. And by missing links, I mean that the wildlife where the wildlife sanctuary had a deep use that was done by people who lived in the wildlife sanctuary and even considered some land within the wildlife sanctuary as their own. So what was a way where we could recreate some of those missing links? And within the sanctuary itself, what were some of the visual artifacts, right? What were some of the memories? And what were some of the memorabilia that local people themselves felt should be represented? You might ask, why does this matter? Um, and why it mattered for me to do this was that it sort of started to give me what I like to call the past in the presentness. So while I was in the landscape and part of these really exciting teams of scientists where we were looking at space in a very interesting way of looking at what are we going to discover. um, I always felt that we weren't looking at the past with the rigor and the excitement that it deserved. And then when I finally went to tell my field assistants and all the older people that, I've finished a lot of my PhD and I have this idea. Um, and I just wanted to see what they would tell me. And one of them told me this in Hindi. He said, "Aapko abhi pata chala," which means, did you come to know about this now? Like, why did you think about it when your PhD was almost ending? And this ties to also a very nice paper on memories of people who have faced violence during the partition between India and Pakistan. And when people started to go and document their stories, a similar thing was told to them where they asked, "Why have you come so late?" And so, doing the Eagle Nest a project of time gave me it gave me a wonderful opportunity to go back and learn about the same protected area where I would look at all these species, to suddenly go back and figure out where people had planted fruits and don't visit the protected area anymore, right? And figuring out the nuances and basically looking at the protected area through new eyes. It was also about, this is my colleague who was the illustrator who worked with me. And to us, it was also about how people related and grew up in these protected areas and had multiple meanings that they attach to even something like this. So this is a rock, um, and this was a rock that was used um, by everybody in the village to measure their height. So you measure your height against this rock, and as children they would then know how much they've grown with respect to somebody else from a far off village, because they would discuss their height on the rock. And for 4 years while I did my PhD, um, these were experiences that were never really presented to any researcher in Eagle Nest, and I was very glad to be part of this process of figuring out time with an illustrator, because it opened my eyes to multiple other stories. So our settings for the Eagle Nest Memory Project um, were in multiple places. It was going down and doing the migratory paths of people through the protected areas, to meeting the last honey gatherers who were able to sing songs to the honey gatherers, and also figure out how to keep themselves safe from the bees and getting their stories. So this is a colleague of mine. He is Chumbi Megeji. He's one of the last honey gatherers from the Shedukpen community. And the artist and I were getting him to tell us his story. Our sampling design for the Eagle Nest Memory Project was fairly straightforward. We had an open-ended and semi-structured questions. The illustrator interpreted and translated these drawings. We shared transcripts and illustrations back with the people, because this was co-produced with them. And then finally, when we had to proofread um, like some of the books or some of the chapters, we would go back to people and read with them and ask them what they wanted us to change, and get that changed again. And finally, we had the option of publishing or not. We had two minds about it, and more about that a bit later. So these are just a couple of examples of what came of the Eagle Nest Memory Project. So on the left is Kaibu Fiang. He is one of the last village priests of the Bugun community, and he's holding a picture of what Anjora recreated based on a very old photograph of what he was as a young priest. So this is Kaibu Fiang as a young priest, and this is him now in his 80s. Kaibu Fiang was a very important man, and he used to be a dark runner, which is the equivalent of somebody who gives you your post but has no way, but has to do all the logistics with respect to taking your post from point A to point B. So there would not be a car or there would not be a bike that you could run with. You yourself had to be the post runner. So Kaibu Fiang was a post runner. Um, and in 1959, when the 14-year-old Dalai Lama came to Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary, Kaibu Fiang was being a post runner, and he hadn't known that the Dalai Lama was escaping from Tibet. And he sat and he had lunch with him, and he was very touched by this man who was in the middle of the forest. And a year later, the war between China and India erupted, and Kaibu Fiang stopped being he stopped being a post runner. He came back to his village, And in his village, he belongs to a priestly clan. So he started doing these pujas. He started doing these ceremonies and was at it in full form when the Dalai Lama visited Eagle Nest again in 2003. Um, and 2006, he was there now in his new avatar as, uh, as the main village priest. And that whole story of Kaibu Fiang and how it all came together was that from a dark runner who met Dalai Lama as a young boy to a village priest who was very influenced, who started getting very influenced by animism. He was instrumental in uh, negotiating with his community, which was now moving and following the practices of Buddhism. He was instrumental with his community to not only stop animal sacrifice, but also decrease the hunting of wildlife. Because he said that the fact that the Dalai Lama has come to the area that we are in has a special significance, and if we are to follow the tenets of Buddhism, this must be these two things must be something that is followed. So on the left here, you will see a variety of species of what used to be used in pujas and in ceremonies, like a hornbill, a tiger, a leopard, a lot of big cats, and eagle talons. And from 1959 to the last animal that was sacrificed here happened in 1994, after which the Buguns have stopped um, sacrificing animals. They symbolically take them to the altar and then they put a red vermilion powder on their heads and let them go free. Looking at the same protected area, the same pictures where I showed you the marble cat found in the undisturbed area, uh, also started to make me look at these landscapes in completely different ways. So for instance, this is Chaku. It is right in the middle of Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary. Before that, it used to actually be an outpost that the army had. And Chaku in the early 80s was one of the most remote polling stations in India. It was actually declared as the most remote polling stations in India. And I managed to get some of the electoral rolls of people who had polled in Chaku and got their experiences of what it meant like to lug um, or lug a booth right to the middle of the forest to get two people to vote. Um, I also started to realize the past and the presentness was also interesting in some of the patterns that I see. So, for instance, that road where my field assistants were helping me, and why a lot of the sampling in Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary is really difficult, was this very significant story that residents told me, where there was a plan to make a highway through that road because it is in a geopolitically sensitive area, and it's much easier for the Chinese to access some parts of India than it is for the Indians to come up and go to the same areas. So there was a plan for a highway to be expanded, and there was also an alternative to go to build a road from a completely different area, which was a non-protected area. But there existed a road, the same sort of road that I showed you where I did my transects, and they were keen to make it at least wider. And so there was a public interest litigation that was filed in the Supreme Court of India, and they sent a committee to come and visit the area. And on the day the committee was visiting, Um, there was one car that had gone ahead, and there was another car on the other side, and they were blocked for the entire day, because there was an elephant um, that was giving birth to a young one, and the members of who were in both vehicles were able to see that. And that a lot I spoke to a few members um, from that committee, and a lot of them said that there was no way that they would expand the road having seen that. And that little photo is the placenta of the baby that was born and probably saved Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary a lot of the work and a lot of the fights we may have had to do in this day and age. And that the Eagle Nest Memory Project also allowed me um, to go back to be with the people I am with, and I also look at them, also meet them in a different light. So this is Saila Baje, who would tell me that he was never coming with me after every single transact, and uh, yet he would. But at the same time, I got to also meet him and understand him in a completely different light. So this is when he was um, these are actually some of his pictures that he wanted to share with me of him as a young man, and he used to use a lot of his savings to go down 70 kilometers to this studio to get these pictures with him and his friends. And these are the Eagle Nest Memory Project also included some of the more recent activities that have happened in the community reserve with our staff, that a lot of older residents wanted more people to remember um, aspects of what they felt were important for their forests. And so finally, what was easier to do was write the Eagle Nest Memory Project up as a paper. We did have a website where the website was important for us to have, where we wanted some of the visual memorabilia that people had shared to go back to them, and a way where it could be easily accessible to them. So we had a website, and then there was a plan for a book. These are some of the pages of the book when it finally happened, of really amazing women who stayed in a forest. Some raised their children there, some lost their children there. And a very, very long story short, but the Eagle Nest Memory Project finally took 4 years to see the light of day. And that happened roughly over a year, roughly last year. And I also started to think about where would it be that I'd want to release this book. A lot of my publishers wanted me to come to the capital of India and release it in New Delhi, and I was like, no, there is no way I can do it, because I really wanted to take this book back uh, to the people who helped me create it and worked with me to make this possible. So this was again the honey collector. To remind you again, this is the honey collector and his wife helping me with the forest and their stories. And in 2020, when it was finally ready, unfortunately, the book was ready, but Chumbi Megaji had lost his wife, and also much had changed with respect to how he was living. He was a much older man, but he was nevertheless very thrilled to have this book that he said that he wanted to leave for his grandson. And finally, last year, the Eagle Nest Memory Project, in a way, was set free. And it made me really happy that I was able to set it free in a space that I was able to study in, which is the community reserve and Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary. And I was really happy to set it free with the three oldest living people from the Shedukpen community and the Bugun community, with Muyaya, the 94-year-old woman, was very, very excited for my book, and she kept asking, when is it that you're going to finish it? Who made a special effort to come and release the Eagle Nest Memory Project with me.
Nandini, your stories are amazing, but I really want to be selfish and let everyone ask you questions because we've been waiting for this talk. So maybe because we have time till 1, so maybe should we go ahead with question time?
Yes, I've finished.
Perfect. Okay. These are very interesting, but we want to ask you questions.
Yes, please do.
We have a comment from Rob, but the question should still come in. While the questions come in, I just want to thank everyone for their participation during seminar this semester. And we have a question. Sushma, why don't you go and unmute yourself if you want to ask a question?
Hi, sorry. Hi, Nandini. I'm not sure if you remember, I actually met you in 2013 when I was visiting Eagle Nest for a little bit, and you were doing one of your transects, I think, for your PhD project. But it's lovely to see all of this come together. And I was just wondering, what about the young people in the communities of Eagle Nest, and in terms of like, is there an aspect of the science that people have been doing in the area that seems to have infiltrated the education of the younger students? And is there like a way to kind of get them interested in the science as well as the community building and the protection of wildlife?
So that hi Sushma, I do remember you on not on one of my transects, but I do remember you after I finished my transects. So I think after 2014, the Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary had a really, really good field director, and we've been working with ever since then, we've been working with about 500 children and 20 schools from around the area to have these annual nature camps. And also there are 2 people from the Shetukpen community who've done their PhD in botany. And we have a master's student, MSc forestry student from the Bugun community of Singchung. Indiglo, you might know him, his son. So there are lots of, there are emerging players of and cohorts of people who are interested in wildlife, who might want to take this up might want to take this up very seriously forward. In fact, some of the students who have come for these nature camps have also published. I didn't get the chance or time to show that. That's a different public, but they've also started to publish like moth list and butterfly list of eagle nest and new moth discoveries. So they've come a very long way and are almost ready to be facilitators themselves.
If you do have questions for Nandini or want to look at the website, there's a link that has been posted here, and please feel free to email her. Thank you so much for your time, Nandini, and this was a lot of fun. Thank you everyone for coming for seminar, and our next speaker will not be speaking to us this semester. And yeah, take care, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, Nandini.
Bye.